On a cold November morning, inside a crowded airport terminal that smelled of burnt coffee and recycled air, a woman named Eleanor Whitfield made a decision that took her exactly 9 seconds. She did not know it then, but those 9 seconds were about to unravel a secret that had been buried for 40 years. She had no idea that one small act of kindness was about to change the course of a stranger's entire life, and her own life right along with it. By the time this story ends, you will understand why a single empty airplane seat became a doorway to a truth so astonishing that even Eleanor, years later, would still find herself replaying that morning in her mind, wondering how something so small could have meant so much. What she didn't know about the old man standing at that gate would change her life forever. Was he simply a stranger who needed help getting home for the holidays? Was there something more to the urgency in his eyes? The way his hands trembled around the handle of his worn leather satchel, the way he kept glancing at the departure board like the next few minutes were the only ones that mattered in his entire life. And what exactly had been waiting 40 years to be found, hidden behind the quiet, unassuming face of a man nobody at that gate would have looked at twice? Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why that morning mattered so much, you have to understand who Eleanor Whitfield was before any of this happened. She was 34 years old, a hospice nurse from Springfield, Ohio, the kind of woman who spent her days sitting beside strangers in their final hours holding hands that no one else wanted to hold. She had been raised by a father who taught her that kindness was not something you saved for people who deserved it, but something you gave out freely, especially to the ones who seemed to need it most. That morning, she was flying home for the first Christmas since her mother had passed, carrying a suitcase full of ornaments her mother used to hang every December, the kind of small, sentimental cargo that makes an airport feel heavier than it should. She had booked her ticket weeks in advance, paid extra for an aisle seat near the front of the plane so she could get off quickly and reach her father before the evening service at their church. It was not a flight she could afford to be flexible about. Her father had been alone in that house for 11 months, and she had promised him she would be there before the candles were lit. So when she arrived at the gate that morning and found it packed wall to wall with stranded travelers, raised voices, and gate agents repeating the same apology over and over, she felt her stomach tighten the way it always did when a plan she was counting on began slipping out of her hands. The flight had been oversold. It happens more often than most travelers realize. Selling more seats than the plane actually holds, betting that a few passengers will not show up. That morning, every single one of them had. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, asking for volunteers to take a later flight in exchange for travel vouchers. And a restless murmur moved through the crowd, the way it does when people sense a problem is about to become their problem. Eleanor barely looked up from her phone. She had a seat. She had paid for it. She had a father waiting for her. And nothing about that morning was going to change. That was when she noticed him. An old man, standing near the counter, alone, with no one beside him and nothing in his hands but that same worn leather satchel he kept gripping, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. He was speaking quietly to the gate agent, his voice too soft to carry over the noise of the terminal. But his face told the story his words could not. He was not arguing. He was not raising his voice like the others around him. He simply stood there, asking, the way a man asks when he has run out of other options and is too proud to show it. The gate agent shook her head. The old man nodded slowly, the kind of nod that comes from someone who has been told no more times in his life than he would ever admit. And he began to step back from the counter toward the rows of plastic chairs, toward another long day of waiting in an airport that had nowhere left to put him. Nobody else in that gate area seemed to notice him at all. People were buried in their phones, their headphones, their own delays and frustrations, and an old man quietly losing his seat barely registered as a ripple in a terminal full of people who had problems of their own. Eleanor noticed. She always noticed. It was the same instinct that had made her good at her job, the ability to see the person other people walked past without seeing at all. She watched him for a long moment, the way his shoulders had curved forward just slightly more than they had when he first stood at that counter, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the jet bridge, like it was a door closing on something he could not afford to lose. She did not know his name. She did not know where he was going, or why it mattered so much that he get there today instead of tomorrow. All she knew was that something about the look on his face reminded her of every patient she had ever sat beside who was running out of time, and she could not make herself look away. She stood up before she had fully decided to. Her boarding pass was still in her hand when she crossed the gate area toward him, and she would later say she did not plan a single word of what she was about to say. It simply came out of her, the way the truth sometimes does, when you stop thinking and start feeling instead. She asked him where he was trying to go. He told her, his voice quiet, almost embarrassed to be asked. She asked him if it was important. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, and something in the way he said yes made her chest tighten in a way she could not explain. Eleanor walked back to the counter and told the gate agent she would like to give up her seat. The gate agent blinked at her, asked her twice if she was certain, reminded her that the next available flight would not leave for several hours, possibly longer if the weather over the Midwest did not cooperate. Eleanor said she understood. She said it anyway. She walked back to the old man, pressed her boarding pass into his hand before he could argue, and told him simply that he needed this flight more than she did. He stared down at the boarding pass like it was something he did not quite believe was real. And when he finally looked back up at her, his eyes were wet in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, dry air of the terminal. He did not simply thank her. What he said instead was quieter, stranger. The kind of sentence that would not fully make sense to Eleanor until much later. He told her she had no idea what she had just done for him, that she had no idea what this flight meant, what it had taken him 40 years to work up the courage to do. Eleanor laughed it off the way people do when a stranger says something a little too heavy for a casual goodbye, told him to have a safe flight, and watched him walk toward the jet bridge clutching that boarding pass like it was the only thing standing between him and something he had waited his entire life to face. She did not know. Standing there in that nearly empty gate area with her own flight still hours away, that she would spend the rest of that day and many days after it thinking about the way he had said those words. She did not know that an old man's quiet, almost apologetic request for a seat on a plane was about to lead her into a story that had been hidden inside one family for 4 decades. She did not know that the kindness she had given away so easily, in 9 seconds, without a second thought, was about to be returned to her in a way she could never have imagined. What she didn't know about that stranger was about to change her life forever. Eleanor's new flight did not leave until almost 9 that night, which meant 6 hours sitting in a terminal chair with nothing to do but think. At first, she told herself she was thinking about her father, about the candles he would be lighting alone if her flight kept slipping later, about the ornaments wrapped in tissue paper inside her suitcase. But somewhere around the second hour, her mind kept drifting back to the old man, and the way his voice had cracked when he told her she had no idea what she had just done for him. She found herself replaying it over and over. The way you replay a sentence that does not fully make sense the first time you hear it, certain there is something underneath it you have not yet understood. She tried, more than once, to talk herself out of caring. He was a stranger. She would never see him again. Whatever 40 years of waiting he was carrying onto that plane was his business, not hers, and she had a father of her own to think about. But hospice work does something to a person over the years. It teaches you to recognize the particular weight certain people carry, the kind that sits behind the eyes long before it ever reaches the mouth, and she had seen that exact weight on his face. It was not the look of a man missing a connection. It was the look of a man finally walking towards something he had spent decades walking away from. By the time her flight finally boarded that night, Eleanor had pulled out her phone twice to search his name, only to realize she had never actually learned it. He had told her where he was going, not who he was, and in the rush of the moment she had not thought to ask. She remembered small details instead, the faded edges of his leather satchel, a pin on his coat collar that looked older than she was, the way he had held that boarding pass like it might disappear if he loosened his grip. None of it amounted to anything she could search. By midnight, sitting in her father's kitchen back in Springfield with the Christmas tree lights still glowing in the next room, she had mostly let the thought go, filed away the way good deeds usually are, a warm memory with no real ending. January came and went, the way it always does in Ohio, gray and slow, and Eleanor went back to the rhythm of 12-hour shifts and quiet rooms and families saying goodbye to people they loved. She did not think about the old man every day, but every so often, usually late at night after a hard shift, his voice would surface in her memory uninvited. "You have no idea what you just did for me," and she would wonder, briefly, where he had ended up, whether whatever he had been racing toward had been worth the 40 years it took him to get there. It was the second week of February when the letter arrived. There was no return address on the envelope, only her name and Springfield address written in handwriting so careful and deliberate it looked almost formal. The kind of penmanship taught in schools that no longer exist. Eleanor almost set it aside with the rest of the mail, assuming it was some kind of solicitation, but something about the weight of the envelope made her open it, standing in her own doorway before she had even taken off her coat. Inside was a single folded page, and at the bottom of it, a name she had never properly learned until that moment. The letter was short. It did not explain everything, not even close, but it told her enough to make her sit down on the bottom stair of her own staircase and read it 3 more times before she trusted herself to understand it correctly. The man's name was Walter Caldwell. He thanked her again, more formally this time, for what she had done at that gate in November, and he told her that the flight she had given up her seat for had allowed him to reach someone he had not seen in nearly 40 years before it was too late. He did not say who. He did not say why it had taken him 4 decades to make that trip. He only wrote that what happened on that flight had changed everything, and that if she was ever willing, he would like the chance to explain it to her in person. Eleanor sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about ignoring it, the way a person reasonably ignores a stranger's invitation that arrives with more mystery than explanation. But she kept circling back to that same memory from the gate. The rawness in his voice, the way he had looked at the boarding pass like it was something sacred, and she found she could not simply fold the letter back into its envelope and move on. There was a phone number written beneath his signature, and after 3 days of staring at it from across her kitchen counter, she finally picked up the phone and dialed it. Walter answered on the second ring, as though he had been waiting by the phone since the letter went out, and the conversation that followed was the first thread in something neither of them yet understood was about to become a story neither of them would ever forget. He thanked her again, his voice steadier now than it had been in the airport, but still careful, still measured, the voice of a man choosing his words with the same caution he had once used to choose silence for 40 years. He told her there was something he needed to show her, something that had been sitting in a safety deposit box outside of Sacramento since before Eleanor herself had been born, and that her small act of kindness on that overbooked flight had finally given him the courage to go and open it. Eleanor asked him what was inside. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that she thought the call might have dropped, before Walter Caldwell finally answered her with a single sentence that would pull her into a story far bigger than either of them realized. That February afternoon, a story that had been waiting 40 years for someone, anyone, to finally come looking for the truth. Walter did not tell her everything that afternoon. What he said instead, in a voice that had gone quiet again, almost reluctant, was that the box did not contain money, or jewelry, or anything a stranger would expect to hear about over the phone. He said it contained proof of a promise he had made to someone 40 years ago, a promise he had kept every single day since, even after that person had every reason to believe he never would. He told Eleanor it was not something he could explain properly in a phone call, that some things had to be shown, not described, and he asked her, carefully, almost afraid of being refused, whether she would be willing to meet him in person so he could finally tell her the whole story from the beginning. Eleanor agreed before she had time to overthink it. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early March, she found herself driving out past the edge of Springfield to a small house on a quiet stretch of road, the kind of modest, single-story home that gave away nothing about the man who lived inside it. There was no grand entrance, no sign of wealth or status, just a gravel driveway, a porch with 2 wooden chairs, and Walter Caldwell standing in the doorway waiting for her exactly the way he had stood at that gate 4 months earlier, like a man who had spent his entire life being careful not to take up too much space in a room. He invited her inside, made coffee neither of them really drank, and for a long while neither of them spoke about the box at all. Instead, Walter began somewhere else entirely, somewhere 40 years in the past, because he told her there was no way to understand what was in that safety deposit box without first understanding the young man he used to be, and the woman whose face he had spent 4 decades trying not to forget. In the spring of 1984, Walter Caldwell was 26 years old, working double shifts at a machine parts plant outside of Dayton, saving every spare dollar in a coffee can he kept hidden under a floorboard in his rented room. He had grown up with almost nothing, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night, and he had promised himself early on that he would never let money decide what kind of life he was allowed to have. That spring, he met a young woman named Catherine, a nursing student 2 years younger than him, with sharper instincts and a wider laugh, the kind of person who made an entire room feel less crowded the moment she walked into it. Within a year, they were engaged. Catherine came from a family that had built something Walter's family never had, a modest but established hardware business that had been passed down for 2 generations, and her father made no secret of what he thought a machine parts worker had to offer his only daughter. Walter never blamed her father for the doubt. He understood it, even agreed with parts of it, but he loved Catherine in the stubborn, uncomplicated way young men in love often do, certain that hard work and patience would eventually be enough to close the distance between what he had and what her family expected. For a while, it seemed like it might be. Then, in the fall of 1985, everything changed in the space of a single conversation Walter did not even witness. Catherine's father offered Walter a position inside the family business, a real opportunity. The kind of door that almost never opened for a man like him, but it required relocating to manage a second location 2 states away for what was loop. Supposed to be 18 months. Walter took it, not because he wanted to leave, but because he believed it was the only way to ever stand on equal footing in that family. To walk into a room as someone who had built something, instead of someone who was simply tolerated. Catherine was 3 months pregnant when he left, and neither of them yet knew it. What happened over the following 18 months was the kind of quiet, ordinary tragedy that never makes the news but quietly destroys more lives than almost anything else. A string of missed letters, a misunderstanding neither side corrected in time, a proud, frightened young woman who stopped writing back, and a proud, frightened young man 2 states away who told himself her silence meant she had simply moved on without him. By the time Walter finally returned to Dayton, determined to fix whatever had gone wrong, Catherine and her family had already left the state entirely, and the daughter he never knew existed was already 11 months old. Eleanor sat completely still, as Walter told her this part, and when she finally found her voice, the only question she could manage was the one she suspected mattered most. She asked him if he had ever found Catherine again, or the daughter he had never met. Walter looked at her for a long moment, the same look he had given her at the gate. The look of a man standing at the edge of something he had waited his entire life to say out loud, and he told her that the box sitting in that bank vault outside Sacramento held the answer to exactly that question, an answer that had taken him 40 years, 3 private investigators, and one final act of kindness from a stranger on an overbooked flight to finally have the courage to go and face. Walter told Eleanor that he had spent nearly 15 years convinced there was nothing left to search for. Catherine's family had scattered across 3 different states after they left Dayton, and in an era before easy records and online searches, a man with a factory wage and no connections had very few ways of tracing a family that did not want to be found. It was not until the late 1990s, after Walter had quietly built a small but steady life for himself, doing electrical contracting work, that he finally had enough saved to hire someone who knew how to look properly. The first investigator took almost 2 years and found nothing but a dead end in Reno. The second, hired a decade later, found an obituary. Catherine had passed away in 2006, in Sacramento, from complications related to a long illness she had apparently kept private, even from her closest neighbors. Walter read that obituary more times than he could count, sitting alone at his kitchen table, mourning a woman he had not spoken to in over 20 years, but had never once stopped loving in the quiet, complicated way people love the parts of their own past they were never able to finish. At the very bottom of that obituary, listed among surviving family, was a single name that changed the rest of Walter's life. A daughter, Diane Caldwell Hayes, 31 years old, living in Sacramento with a husband and 2 young sons of her own. For the next several years, Walter did not reach out. He told Eleanor this part slowly, like a confession he had rehearsed many times in his own head, but never said out loud to another living person. He was terrified, he said, not of being rejected, but of arriving in his daughter's life and disrupting whatever peace she had built without him, of being the stranger who shows up after 30 years, claiming a place he had not earned through any of the difficult, ordinary days that actually make someone a father. So instead, quietly, without ever introducing himself, Walter began doing the only thing he felt he had any right to do. He started saving for her, the same way he had once saved coins in a coffee can as a young man, except now the amounts were larger, and the discipline had 4 decades of practice behind it. Every month, for nearly 20 years, Walter set aside a portion of his contracting income into a modest investment account, opened quietly under Diane's name, with himself as the custodian, the kind of slow, patient, unglamorous investing that rarely makes headlines but compounds, year after year, into something far larger than anyone watching from the outside would ever expect from a man who drove a 20-year-old pickup truck and wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. By the time Eleanor met him at that gate in November, that account, built one unremarkable contracting paycheck at a time, had grown into just over $1.8 million, sitting untouched, waiting for a daughter who did not even know her father had ever thought of her at all. What finally pushed Walter to act was not the money, and it was not the years catching up to him, though both played their part. It was a single piece of information his investigator uncovered that October, almost by accident, while updating Walter's file. Diane's husband had lost his job earlier that year after his small auto shop folded, and the family was 3 months behind on their mortgage, quietly facing the loss of the only home their 2 boys had ever known. Walter read that report and did not sleep for 2 nights. He told Eleanor that for the first time in nearly 40 years, the fear of staying silent finally outweighed the fear of finally speaking, and he booked a flight to Sacramento before he had time to talk himself out of it again. That was the flight Eleanor had given up her seat for. Walter told her this with his voice breaking for the first time since she had arrived at his house, and Eleanor sat across from him in stunned silence, as the pieces of that overbooked, chaotic November morning finally clicked into place. He had not been racing toward a connecting flight, or a holiday gathering, or any of the small, forgettable reasons most people rush through an airport. He had been racing toward the first conversation he would ever have with his own adult daughter, carrying with him an account statement, a folder of paperwork, and a stack of 40 unsent letters, one written every single year on her birthday since the year she turned 1, that he had never been brave enough to mail. Walter finally opened the safety deposit box for Eleanor 2 weeks later, the 2 of them standing together in a quiet bank vault outside Sacramento, and inside it she found exactly what he had described: 40 handwritten letters tied together with twine, an old photograph of Catherine that had softened at the corners from decades of being held, and the original investment paperwork showing a balance that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. But Walter did not bring her there to show her the money. He brought her there to show her what happened after he landed in Sacramento that November's evening, because the version of that story Eleanor was about to hear was the part neither of them had spoken about yet, the part that explained why a man who had waited 40 years to find his daughter looked, the moment he finally knocked on her door, less afraid than he had been in decades. Walter told Eleanor that the drive from the Sacramento airport to Diane's house took 11 minutes, and that he remembered every single one of them more clearly than entire decades of his own life. He had rehearsed what he would say 1,000 times over the years in his head, standing in his kitchen, lying awake at night, and every version of it had abandoned him completely by the time he stood on her porch that November evening, with the folder of papers shaking slightly in his hands. The house was modest, a single story, with a basketball hoop bolted above the garage, and 2 bicycles leaned against the porch railing. The kind of ordinary American home that gave no hint of the financial trouble quietly unfolding behind its front door. A boy of about 10 answered first, looked up at the unfamiliar old man on the porch, and called back into the house for his mother without taking his eyes off him. When Diane appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel, Walter said he felt every word he had rehearsed disappear at once, and what came out instead was simpler than anything he had planned. He told her his name. He watched her face change slowly, the way a person's face changes when a name they only half remember from old family photographs suddenly attaches itself to a real, living stranger standing in front of them. Diane had grown up knowing only fragments about her father, a few details her mother rarely spoke of, a name she had seen once on an old marriage certificate tucked inside a box of Catherine's belongings. For a long moment, neither of them said anything else. Diane's husband appeared behind her in the hallway, drawn by the silence, and the 2 boys hovered nearby with the particular stillness children get when they sense something important is happening that they are not quite old enough to understand. Walter told Eleanor that he did not try to explain everything at once. He simply said he was sorry, that he had spent 40 years not knowing how to find his way back, and that he understood completely if she wanted him to leave. Diane did not ask him to leave. She stood in that doorway, staring at him for what felt to Walter like several minutes, before finally stepping aside and asking, in a voice barely above a whisper, if he wanted to come inside. They sat at her kitchen table for almost 4 hours that night, and somewhere in the second hour, Walter finally set the folder down in front of her. He explained the account he had opened decades earlier, the modest contracting paychecks he had quietly redirected every month for nearly 20 years, the way the numbers had grown slowly and then, in the last decade, much faster than he ever expected. He told her about the mortgage, that he already knew, that it was already taken care of, and watched Diane's husband put both hands over his face at the kitchen table as the weight of 9 stressful months finally lifted off his shoulders all at once. Then Walter reached into the folder one more time and placed the stack of 40 letters in front of his daughter, one for every birthday he had missed, and told her she did not have to read them that night, or ever, but that he had wanted her to know he had thought of her on every single one. Diane read the first letter out loud at that kitchen table before the night was over, her voice catching halfway through, and by the third letter, both of her sons had climbed up beside her, listening to their grandfather's handwriting describe a little girl he had never met turning 2 years old, then 3, then 5, in a house 4 states away he had never been allowed to enter. Walter told Eleanor that somewhere around the 10th letter, Diane reached across the table and took his hand, the first time his daughter had ever touched him in either of their lives, and that the 40 years standing between that moment and the day she was born seemed, just for a few seconds, to fold completely in on themselves. He told Eleanor all of this sitting in his own modest living room months later, his eyes wet by the time he finished. And then he said the thing that had been the real reason he asked her to come hear the whole story from beginning to end. None of it happens, he told her, not the letters, not the mortgage, not his grandsons learning his name for the first time. If a stranger at a crowded gate that November morning had simply kept her seat the way almost everyone else in that terminal would have. Eleanor tried to wave it off the way she always did when people thanked her for things that felt, to her, like nothing at all. Walter would not let her. He told her that 9 seconds of her time had quietly rewritten the next 40 years for an entire family, and that he intended to make sure she understood exactly what she had done, for as long as he was still alive to say it. In the months that followed, Eleanor and Walter stayed in touch, first through occasional phone calls, then through visits that grew less occasional with time. She was there the following Christmas when Diane's family gathered at Walter's modest house in Sacramento, his first holiday with his daughter and grandsons in 40 years, and she watched from across the room as one of the boys taught his grandfather how to use a video game controller, the two of them laughing at something neither Eleanor nor anyone else quite caught. Walter never let her forget what she had done. Every year on the anniversary of that morning at the gate, a card arrived at Eleanor's house in Springfield. Never with money, never with anything extravagant. Just a few handwritten lines reminding her that an entire family's history had quietly changed direction because a stranger noticed an old man nobody else was looking at. Eleanor still works as a hospice nurse today, still sits beside people in the final hours of their lives, and she says the story of Walter and Diane changed the way she thinks about every patient, every family member, every stranger she passes in a waiting room or an airport terminal. She has said, more than once, that the hardest part of the story to accept was not the 40 years, or the money, or even the letters. It was realizing how close the entire thing came to never happening at all. How easily that morning could have gone the way most ordinary mornings do, with a tired woman keeping her seat, an old man quietly disappearing into a row of plastic chairs, and a daughter in Sacramento never learning her father's name before it was too late. What this story leaves behind is not really a question about Walter, or Catherine, or even Diane, and the home that almost slipped away from her family. It is a question about the people we walk past every single day without ever truly seeing, the ones quietly carrying 40 years, or 4 months, or simply a hard morning, behind a face that gives almost nothing away. Eleanor did not know any of Walter's history when she stood up from her seat that morning. She only knew that something in his eyes did not look right, and she chose to act on it instead of looking away. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. How many people have you walked past in your own life carrying a quiet 40 years of their own? A story you never got the chance to hear simply because nobody stopped long enough to ask. Would you have given up that seat? Knowing nothing about the man standing in front of you, trusting nothing but the look on his face. Let us know in the comments what you would have done, and if this story moved you even half as much as it moved Eleanor and Walter, stay close. Because the next story we have for you is just as unforgettable. A secret hidden inside a small-town bank account that nobody, not even the family it belonged to, ever expected to find. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, Tale by T+, so you never miss it.